welcome, guys, to the final lecture of Unit 1. You've made it this far. You are doing great. This is Professor Tatum here to take you around the world because today we are going global and looking at imperialism beyond U.S. borders in the late 1800s and early 1900s, which is, of course, that period of the Gilded Age. As always, we'll look at a little bit of context. Then we'll look at why the US was considering the idea of getting involved with global imperialism. Then we'll look at things that were pushing the US to join a war that would get them involved in a way with global imperialism. And then we'll look at the Spanish American War, which was essentially a gateway to global imperialism. Then we'll see how that fed directly into another conflict known as the Philippine American War. And then we'll wrap up by looking at a type of epilogue that kind of really shows us how one individual, in a way, personified this period of the Gilded Age from start to finish. All right, to get started, I'd like to clear up some terminology that we need to understand as we move forward. This term imperialism we've already been over in a previous lecture, but as a reminder, this is when one nation or society forcefully expands its influence onto other nations or societies. All right, to clarify, this can happen in several different ways. This can be a spread of influence militarily, politically, culturally, economically. All right, you can either be forcing just ideas, language, things like that onto other people, and that could be considered a form of imperialism. By that standard, we can consider an empire a nation or a group that exerts its power through imperialism. A colony, a lot of students seem to have misunderstandings about this. I learned when I started teaching History 1301 of what exactly a colony is, and that seems to be something that's not very well explained to a lot of students in earlier levels of education. So, to clarify, a colony is essentially territory claimed by an empire, and most frequently, it's a distant extension of an empire. All right. So, for example, if we think of the 13 American colonies on the East Coast that were colonies claimed by Great Britain, right? Well, Great Britain is nowhere near the Atlantic East Coast of North America. They're all the way over on the other side of the world. Yet they staked a claim over these territories that are along the East Coast. That is a colony, all right? They're these territories claimed by an empire that exist to serve an empire. All right, this is basically where empires stake a claim elsewhere and are extracting resources and expanding their influence by having a presence within that colony. And as we've discussed before, there was a great deal of global imperialism occurring throughout this period. A lot of European nations, as well as the Japanese Empire, were practicing imperialism globally, colonizing territories in Asia and in Africa, vying for control of who would claim what territory and who would have access to what types of resources. In the US, we saw largely stayed out of this for the most part until the very final years of the 1800s because they already had their own imperial project going on, right? They were busy imperializing the West. They were busy with their domestic imperial project in the West, trying to expand their influence onto Native Americans and incorporate them into U.S. society through things like the Indian Wars, the Dawes Severalty Act, and Indian boarding schools. But by 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the frontier was closed, meaning that all territory in the mainland United States, from the East Coast to the West Coast, okay, so from the Atlantic to the Pacific, had all been claimed by the United States and was either a U.S. state or a territory that was on its way to becoming a state. So now what? Does the U.S. just say, okay, we're good, we've completed our domestic imperial project, we are now a great nation, we can be left alone, we're just going to focus on our own? Or should they start getting involved in more global affairs? And this is kind of the final pending question we left off with in terms of this ambiguous state that the United States is in during the Gilded Age. As it's being reconstructed into a modern nation, there's all kinds of questions that were kind of being answered during the Gilded Age about what that modern United States would look like. And I had suggested that by the election of 1896 and the failure of the Populist Party, a lot of those questions by that point had already kind of been addressed, and we kind of knew what the new modern United States would look like domestically. But the final kind of question on the table is what will its role be in the world? right? And we need to understand there were a lot of pressures for this new modern United States to move beyond its borders and start expanding its influence into other parts of the world. And so there were all different types of pressures for this global imperialism. And as we look forward at these different types of pressures that were placed on the US from within to get involved in global affairs and global imperialism, I want you to consider which of these you find to have had the strongest impact, would have been the most significant. All right. Was this global imperialism that the US did, giving a spoiler there, wind up getting involved in, most heavily impacted by military pressures, or by economic pressures, or by cultural and racial pressures? Keep that in mind as we move forward. Let's take a look first at some military pressures that the US was faced with from within. First of all, there's already all these other countries getting involved in large scale imperialism. And as they're doing this, they're strengthening their militaries, all right? They're becoming very powerful. And the US is kind of getting afraid that maybe if they don't go get involved and they don't build up their military, they could be seen as this weak nation that could become susceptible to being colonized by one of these other powerful nations who's out expanding their influence around the world. They said maybe we need to go show that we just have as much power as all these other nations who are out carving up the world by getting involved. There was also a lot of military pressure coming from a historian, a guy named Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was a military historian who wrote this very influential book titled The Influence, and look at that, of Sea Power Upon American History. And in this book, Mahan argued that all of the most powerful nations and empires throughout history had always had very powerful navies, right? And that having a powerful navy was key to having a legitimate global standing and to being powerful and respected among other nations. So Mahan suggested that if the US, as this new modern nation, wanted to be taken seriously and really wanted to become a powerful nation, that they needed to grow their military, all right? They needed to expand their naval influence. But he also suggested that in order to have this big, expansive navy, the US would also need naval bases around the world, right? Where these ships could stop and fuel, where the Navy could station themselves to man these ships and do what they need to do. And those bases would also serve as symbols of US imperialism, right? They serve as symbols of the United States has a presence here. We have expanded our influence into this region. So that would require the US to begin claiming territories around the world, or at least claiming influence in territories around the world where they could establish these naval bases. So there's definitely some militaristic pressures coming from within for the US to go get involved in this global imperialism. But there were also a great deal of economic pressures. Overall, as there was this big boom in economics during the Industrial Revolution of the Gilded Age, there was a push to expand American markets abroad. A lot of big businesses wanted access to more customers and more resources and more places to open factories. Furthermore, if they were going to begin expanding their markets globally, they would need fueling stations around the world so that they could fuel their merchant ships. And that would require, once again, the US to start staking a claim in some territories around the world where they could establish these fueling stations for merchant ships. There were some efforts a little earlier in the Gilded Age to expand American markets globally. So, for example, just a couple years after the Civil War, the U.S. purchased Alaska from Russia. That was considered a great folly at the time, a great failure. But as it turned out, Alaska had some very valuable resources that have come in handy over the years. They also started establishing trade agreements with island nations like Hawaii and Samoa. Again, had very valuable, profitable resources. They also established a naval base in Hawaii, which was Pearl Harbor. Anyone who knows much at all about 20th century U.S. history knows that Pearl Harbor will be important moving forward. U.S. fruit companies also established extensive influence in countries like Hawaii and Cuba and began expanding their influence throughout Latin America. Those fruit companies had extensive influence in these countries. So we can see that throughout the Gilded Age, While the US was not getting militarily involved in global imperial affairs, they were already starting to begin to expand their markets somewhat economically. All right, so in addition, though, to these militaristic and economic pressures from within for the US to begin expanding elsewhere, there were also some racial and cultural pressures. A lot of this was based on ideas like social Darwinism, suggesting that certain races and cultures of people were inherently more fit to govern the world than others. And a lot of white Americans saw themselves as superior to people of other cultures and other races around the world and began calling for an expansion of Anglo American culture to other people around the world. Some people even began suggesting that there was a responsibility for white English speaking people to begin, quote unquote, teaching non white English speaking people how to properly live by expanding their influence onto them. But the real kind of moment where the US had to kind of decide whether or not it was going to start getting involved in global imperialism came when there were pushes for the US to get involved in an independence struggle in Cuba. So by the late 1890s, Cuba, this little island here right outside of Florida, was one of the final remaining colonies of the traditional Spanish Empire in the Americas. All right. So if you haven't taken History 1301 yet, the Spanish Empire was very powerful during the colonial period. They had extensive influence all the way up into the southwest of North America, into California, had claims over Mexico, controlled the majority of South America, with an exception of Brazil, because under a treaty that was blessed by the Pope, apparently God wanted the Portuguese to have Brazil, but don't get too caught up in that. What I'm getting at is the Spanish Empire had tremendous influence over the Americas, at least on paper. Most of that was actually controlled by indigenous peoples for quite some time, but they had this big claim of territory. But by the 1890s, several of these territories have fought their own wars for independence and declared themselves as independent nations. But Cuba was still controlled by the Spanish Empire. They were, along with Puerto Rico here, were some of the last colonies that the Spanish Empire was hanging on to in North America. And there was a movement for Cuban independence led by a revolutionary leader named Jose Marti. And many Americans looked to this revolution and they felt a lot of sympathy for the Cuban people. They said, look, what we see here is a colony who is seeking independence from an empire. This is pretty similar to what the US went through, right? We were a series of British colonies who declared independence from the British Empire and established our own independent nation. That's kind of what the people here in Cuba are doing. So maybe we should be good neighbors and go help them earn this independence, right? The way that countries like France and kind of ironically Spain helped us earn our independence. And Spain did not take kindly to this independence movement, all right? They wanted to keep their foothold over this valuable colony of Cuba. They had too much invested there, especially in things like sugar. So they wanted to maintain their control over Cuba, and they were very repressive to the members of this independence movement. To kind of try to crush the independence movement, they began concentrating a lot of Cuban people into concentration camps. So I want to pause real quick and clarify that concentration camps actually has a pretty broad definition. I know people hear that word, and many of us automatically think of things like Nazi death camps and gas chambers and things like that. But really, anywhere where there's people being politically concentrated into a certain area, that is a form of a concentration camp. Okay, there have been arguments made that seem sensible to me that even Indian reservations were a form of concentration camps. All right, there were people being concentrated to particular areas for political reasons. But in these concentration camps, people were being forced to live together in small spaces. So there was a lot of sickness spreading. There was also limited access to things like food. So there's a great deal of starvation. A lot of suspected members of the independence movement were also tortured by the Spanish military. And as people in the US began hearing about their neighbors right across the Gulf of Mexico and Cuba being placed in concentration camps where they were starving and dying of illness and being tortured, a lot of them began saying, we really need to go get involved here. We need to go kick the Spanish out of there and help these people gain their independence. Furthermore, U.S. businesses began pressuring the president, William McKinley, to go get involved in this war for Cuban independence as well. Right? They were saying that they had a lot of interests in Cuba. They had their fruit and sugar companies invested in Cuba. And as long as there was this war for independence going on, their interests were being threatened. So they wanted the U.S. government to come in and bring a sense of stability to Cuba to help protect their economic interests there. There was also pressure for the US to get involved in this war with Spain and Cuba from journalists known as yellow journalists. Prominent yellow journalists included people like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. These were big newspaper tycoons who were willing to do whatever it took to sell their newspapers, all right? So they would try to grab the public's attention by selling these very exaggerated stories. And in this moment where the US was considering getting involved in this independence struggle in Cuba and fighting against Spain, yellow journalists said, well, wars make great stories, so let's try to get the US involved in this war. And they would really exaggerate all the things that were happening in Cuba, all right? So they would kind of see true stories about what's going on in Cuba. And they'd really try to make it seem like things were a lot worse than they actually were. Now, I'm not saying there were not harsh conditions in Cuba, there certainly were, but these guys really blew it out of proportion to try to sway the American public to push the government to go to war. So let's look at an example here of how they did this. So what you see pictured here is an actual pile of human remains, okay, human bones. But we need to understand where these bones came from, all right? In a lot of places around the world where there's limited land space, such as in Cuba, there's a practice where when somebody passes away, their body will be buried, and then over a certain span of time, their body will be reinterred and located somewhere else. That way, there's still more space as more and more people continue to die over time. A lot of places around the world will have kind of mass tombs where these remains can be reinterred. But what we see here is they just kind of have an outdoor communal space where these remains can be placed after being buried for their set amount of time. Well, while Cuba was fighting its war for independence and there was pressure for the US to get involved, yellow journalists would print pictures like this right alongside stories of their exaggerated atrocities that the Spanish were committing against the people of Cuba. So the public would begin to assume these must be the bones of Cuban people being killed by the Spanish. All right. And this really got people up in arms, thinking that the situation was much worse than it was, and amplified the public's desire to get involved in this conflict and to expel Spain from Cuba. But the final straw that got the US really involved in this war in Cuba against Spain was the explosion of a US Navy ship called the USS Maine. So this ship had been sent to Cuba to kind of investigate what was really going on there, see how much of what these yellow journalists were saying was true. And they also had the goal that if things were as bad as they sounded, to get some American people out of there. And they were docked in Havana, Cuba, when kabloom, that ship just got blown to smithereens. So there were 250 or so American sailors on board who died in this explosion. And the cause of the explosion at the time was unknown. Nobody knew why this ship blew up. But with the support of yellow journalism, the American public kind of jumped to this conclusion that, well, it must have been the Spanish came and blew that ship up. That's the only reasonable explanation for how this ship blew up. So now we kind of have to go to war with the Spanish because look, they have destroyed an American ship and killed over 250 American sailors. And at this point, there was so much pressure on President McKinley and the rest of the US government that they kind of gave in and said, look, at this point, it's the only reasonable thing to do. We've got to go to war. Right? Kind of convenient how this all worked out, though. By the way, we now know years down the road that the true cause of this explosion had nothing to do with any kind of external sabotage by the Spanish or by anyone else for that matter. What really caused this ship to explode was that there was a big buildup of the coal in the ship that was powering the ship, and there was a lot of gunpowder stored near that big coal buildup. And if you have a lot of heat building up, and you have something explosive like gunpowder, guess what? There's gonna be a big kabloom. The Spanish got blamed for this. That was used to justify the war that followed, but it was all puro malarkey. So, this Spanish American War that started when the US got involved in the independence movement in Cuba proved to be a gateway for the US to get further involved in global imperialism. But the US tried to kind of make it seem like that was not their intention when they first got involved in this conflict. Early on, the US quickly wrote the Teller Amendment, which I believe you guys saw in one of your readings, stated that the US's goal in getting involved in this independence struggle in Cuba was simply to help the Cuban people secure their independence, right? They were not interested in any kind of long term um, influence. They weren't there to expand their political control over the people of Cuba. They were just there to help them win their independence, and they were going to back off after that. This really helped justify the US's actions in Cuba to the rest of the world, helping them see that, oh, our war against Spain is simply a war against their oppression of the people of Cuba, and we are trying to just help liberate the people of Cuba. That's our only intention here. Hold that thought. So while the US was fighting Spain and Cuba, they got a little distracted and they went ahead and invaded Hawaii as well. All right, so there had been a lot of political instability in Hawaii leading up to the year of the Spanish American War. And some of the trade relations that the US had established in Hawaii had gone sour by that point. And so during this war, the US went and invaded Hawaii. Now, their justification for this was, well, Hawaii is an island not too far off the west coast of the United States. Spain, who the US was at war with, could potentially use Hawaii as a base from which they could come invade the United States. So, as a preventative measure, we better go in, overthrow the government of Hawaii, take over there, and make sure that Spain can't use it as a base to attack us from. Okay. But then they also got distracted in Puerto Rico and then at Guam and the Philippines. All right. Using that same excuse that Spain could potentially use these islands as bases from which they could attack the US. Puerto Rico, maybe, okay. It's not far from Cuba and it's not far from the US, and it was a Spanish colony. Okay, I can maybe see the justification there, pushing it a little bit. But Guam and the Philippines, all the way out off the coast of Asia, that's quite a stretch, okay? So it's pretty clear what the US was really doing here was they were taking advantage of being at war with Spain and using it as an opportunity to go begin expanding their influence to island nations around the world. What they were doing here was expanding their influence globally, all right? They were really taking off with this global imperialism. So by the end of the war, the US now had all these territories they had acquired throughout the war. Not only Cuba, who they helped gain their independence, but they also now had influence in Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico. They were faced with the question here: what should we do with these territories? Should we give them back to the people of those nations and help them establish independent nations, naval bases, or should we perhaps stick around and spread our influence permanently over these territories? They went with option B. So, with Cuba, at the end of the war, the US required the people of Cuba to add an amendment to their constitution called the Platt Amendment. All right, and the Platt Amendment made Cuba a protectorate of the United States, meaning that they were kind of at the mercy in many ways of the United States. So, for example, they couldn't make treaties with any other country without US approval. They could not be annexed by any other country without US approval. So remember, the Teller Amendment said that the US's goal in Cuba was to help Cuba become an independent nation. This doesn't look a whole lot like independence, all right? It looks more like the US had an intention all along of sticking around and maintaining some sense of influence in Cuba. Furthermore, after the Spanish American War, the U.S. built a military base in Cuba known as Guantanamo Bay. Okay, I'm starting to see something happening here. And then in Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, all of these were made into U.S. territories. And in all of these territories, the U.S. began establishing naval bases that also, in many cases, served the purpose of being fueling stations for merchant ships, which were very valuable for trading with countries like China. Isn't this a little strange? This is exactly what people around the US have been saying the US should get involved with. And then the US conveniently says, okay, we're going to go help the people of Cuba gain their independence. And in the process, we're going to start taking over all these islands just to make sure that Spain can't use them against us. But then after the war, they started doing all these things they said they were going to do before they even got involved in this conflict. All right. So we can kind of see, is the U.S. used the war in Cuba against Spain as an opportunity to begin expanding things like their militaristic and their economic influence globally. All right, but when the U.S. really tried to establish their control over the Philippines, they were faced with some resistance. So the people of the Philippines, during the Spanish-American War, when the U.S. first came in, had been fighting an independence movement against Spain, and they were kind of under the impression that what the US was doing there was helping them gain their independence. All right. The kind of funny thing about independence movements is at the end of their wars, they expect, wait for it, independence. So when the US stuck around, kind of saying, well, we're going to control this territory now, and you're going to allow us to do all these things here, they were pretty upset. And the leader of their independence movement, Emilio Aguinaldo, kind of shifted the focus of their independence war from fighting against Spain to now fighting against the US. And this war, in which the peoples of the Philippines were fighting for independence from the US, was known as the Philippine American War. So we see that the Spanish American War fed directly into this Philippine American War. And in the Philippine American War, we really saw the influence of racial motivations for global imperialism. Right during this period, there was a British author named Rudyard Kipling. You may know his name as the author of The Jungle Book. Pretty fascinating book. There's some great film adaptations of it. But unfortunately, he's also the author of The White Man's Burden. So he wrote this poem as the U.S. was facing war with the Filipinos. And let's take a listen to what this thing has to say and try to break it down and see what it really means.
The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness, on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror, and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit, and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace, fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly, bring all your hope to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread, go make them with your living, and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of hosts ye humour, ah, slowly toward the light, why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom, to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent sullen peoples shall weigh your gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come now to search your manhood through all the thankless years, cold edge with dear-bought wisdom, the judgment of your peers.
Imagine you're playing a game where one team decides it's their job to help everyone else play better. They believe they know what's best for others and feel responsible for guiding them. This idea of taking on responsibility for others because you think you know better is similar to the concept of white man's burden. The white man's burden was a belief held by Europeans during the 19th and early 20th centuries. They thought it was their duty to bring civilization and progress to people in other parts of the world, often societies in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. This belief was tied to ideas of racial superiority, where Europeans considered themselves more advanced and capable of improving the lives of others. For example, when European powers colonized countries in Africa and Asia, they often justified their actions by claiming they were helping to bring modernity, technology, and religion to societies they viewed as less developed. This was seen as a responsibility they had to fulfill for the benefit of those they colonized, even if those people didn't necessarily ask for or welcome their help. In literature and political speeches of the time, this idea was promoted as a noble mission. For instance, Rudyard Kipling, a famous British writer, wrote a poem titled The White Man's Burden in 1899, encouraging the United States to take up its role as an imperial power and bring its version of progress to the Philippines, which it had recently acquired as a colony. However, the concept of the white man's burden has faced criticism. Many argue that it was a justification for imperialism and exploitation, allowing Europeans to rationalize their control over territories and resources under the guise of civilizing native populations. Critics also highlight the arrogance and paternalism in the belief that one group of people knows what's best for everyone else. In summary, the white man's burden is the belief that certain groups of people have a duty to impose their ideas of civilization and progress on others whom they perceive as less developed. It raises important questions about power dynamics, ethics, and the impact of colonialism on global history and cultures.
All right, so the white man's burden that Rudyard Kipling is suggesting the United States has in this moment is clearly referring to a responsibility, kind of duty to go colonize places like the Philippines, all right, where there's people who he considers to be less civilized and in need of Euro American guidance, right? Uh, in his poem, he considers them half devil and half child, right? He basically says some people might hate you for this, but they'll remember eventually that you did the right thing here, right? And your peers will look at you honorably and see that you're doing the right thing. So clearly, here we do see there were some racial motivations driving some of this imperialism, right? With things like the white man's burden. Further evidence of racial pressures for American global imperialism comes from President William McKinley himself, who was a firm believer in things like the white man's burden and stated that it was America's duty to civilize and Christianize the people of the Philippines. All right, so people like McKinley and Rudyard Kipling are suggesting that there's some kind of honorable duty that the people of the United States have to the people of the Philippines, and kind of speaking more broadly for the fact that white English speaking people have a responsibility to other peoples of the world to somehow enlighten them. What does the US taking up the white man's burden in the Philippines really entail? It involved things like rounding up Filipino people, especially suspected rebels, and putting them into concentration camps where they frequently faced a great deal of illness and starvation, and also torturing suspected members of the independence movement. Now, this is kind of ironic. Let's think back to when the U.S. was considering getting involved in the war with Spain, the war for Cuban independence against Spain. A lot of people had issues with the fact that the Spanish in Cuba were doing things like putting people in concentration camps where they were facing starvation and illness, and they were torturing suspected rebels. And now, ironically, the US used that as an excuse to get involved in global affairs. And from there, they got involved in this other country that they had no business really being in. And they're doing the exact same types of things here, right? And justifying it as saying, well, they're in need of our guidance. We're just taking up the white man's burden. Okay, we need to understand that by the end of the Philippine American War, the US had secured territorial claims not only over the Philippines, but over several different island nations. All right, they now had control over Cuba as a protectorate. They had Hawaii, Guam, and Puerto Rico, all its territories. They were establishing bases and American markets in all of these countries. And this kind of really puts the final seal on what this new modern America post Civil War will look like. Okay, this essentially marks the end of the Gilded Age, kind of answers that final question of what the role of the US will be globally. Very clearly, this new post war US will be defined as an imperial nation that's going to be active in global affairs, all right? And they're going to, in some cases, take advantage of difficult situations that some peoples in certain countries might be in and use those as opportunities to continue to spread their influence globally. This continues all the way even somewhat into the 21st century. Okay, so I want to wrap up with this. This is just something kind of fascinating that I've noticed over time as I study this period. There's one individual who seems to kind of personify the Gilded Age from start to finish, and that's Buffalo Bill, all right, William Cody. Remember, Buffalo Bill had that Wild West show where he portrayed what was allegedly episodes of his real life experience out on the Western frontier. Of course, it was all kind of blown out of proportion. We've been over all that. But we need to understand that Buffalo Bill was a man who felt kind of torn between two worlds, all right, in two periods of time. He considered himself to be, quote unquote, a white Indian, meaning he felt himself to be torn between industrial American culture and what he considered to be the quote unquote savageness of the Western frontier. And that's kind of where the United States stood throughout the Gilded Age. They were this nation that was really kind of undefined. They were in this ambiguous state. They felt, on one hand, that they were modernizing into this industrial nation, yet they were still clinging in many ways to their traditional agricultural frontier past. In Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, we can kind of see as a metaphor for industrial capitalism in many ways, right? He's providing this service to the American people that's based in many ways on deception, right? He has this artful deception going on where he's exaggerating the truth, bringing in elements of other people's stories. He's kind of selling the people the story they want to hear, and the American public knows that there's certain dishonest elements that are creating this product that they're consuming, which is in this case the Wild West show, yet they're still willingly accepting that because they love the end result that it gives them, right? They love that this show confirms their biases, that it tells them a story they want to hear, that it provides them a sense of identity. And that's not much difference than the products and services that were being provided through industrial capitalism that Americans were gladly consuming, despite knowing that it was based on things like child labor and low wages and de-skilling labor, and that it was resulting in these labor disputes that got violent and broke out into riots. And as time went on, Buffalo Bill started incorporating new technologies into his show, definitely demonstrating the innovations of the Gilded Age as he started incorporating lighting features and different types of technologies into his show. Also, as more people began coming into the US from other parts of the world, and especially as the US began expanding their influence into other parts of the world gradually, Buffalo Bill also began expanding the Wild West show to other parts of the world and going and traveling to other countries to give this show. And he also began incorporating different people of different nationalities into his show, kind of showing how the US was developing gradually into a nation that was more part of a global stage. But then by the later years of the early 1900s, something pretty strange happened. The vast popularity of Buffalo Bill's show began to rapidly decline. And eventually he ended up having to cancel the show because he couldn't afford to keep it up because it just wasn't getting enough support. People just didn't seem to care about this show as much anymore. I think this kind of speaks for two different things here. On one hand, again, it's representative of the industrial capitalism that was a product of the Gilded Age. Consumers, which in this case would be Buffalo Bill's audience, are always after that next big thing, right? We want the next product. Sure, we get this product that comes out, we love it, we consume the hell out of it. And then again, scarcity creates value. once we consume this product so much and it's available so much to everybody around us, we kind of start to lose our interest in it. We want a new, bigger, better product. All right. And people were feeling that way. They wanted a new show, they wanted some new form of entertainment. They had kind of gotten their fill of the Wild West show. Furthermore, the decline of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, in a way, shows us the endings of the Gilded Age, in a sense that during the Gilded Age, once again, the US was in this ambiguous status where it was trying to answer questions of what it would look like as a modern nation, seeing what form it would really take. And in the meantime, it was kind of torn between becoming a modern industrial nation while still clinging to its frontier past. Well, by the later years, the early 1900s, it had kind of moved past that frontier past and it had fully embraced becoming this new modern nation, right? And while we still do, in some ways, um, have elements of that frontier past that we like to cling to, and there definitely are legacies of that that have stuck with us even into the present day, we are now a postmodern nation. We've kind of gone even past what we saw develop during the Gilded Age. And I would kind of argue that here in the 2020s, we are living in a second Gilded Age, but I digress there. What I'm getting at is the decline of Buffalo Bill's show can, in many ways, show us the U.S. moving on past the Gilded Age as it had become this new modern America that we've been watching get constructed throughout Unit 1. All right, guys, I'll wrap that up there. You should now have all the content you need to complete exam 1. Good luck on that. Please let me know if you get any questions. Otherwise, this is it for now.